The title was imposed on me by Adrien. I just modified it slightly: globalization, urbanization, and the fate of indigenous languages, the case of Kikongo and Kituba. And what I'm going to do today is not really answering the question whether Kikongo is endangered by whatever other language, especially French, and Kituba too, whether it is also endangered. I think that when Kern Boston spoke a couple of weeks ago, he made it clear that it is misleading to refer to one fixed language called Kikongo. It's a matter of a cluster of genealogically related languages, and as far as I'm concerned, it could also be a case of what we call language or linguistic area in linguistics, in the sense that when there are several languages that are neighboring each other and spoken in the same area, they borrow features from each other and wind up resembling each other structurally, and even in more respects than that, then they become more and more alike. But there is no guarantee, as far as I'm concerned, that these different languages grouped together since the 19th century as belonging to one group are all mutually intelligible, although neighboring languages, if people interact several times frequently across the ethno-linguistic borders, they will understand each other. And I would like to start by explaining my interpretation of globalization, because people have been referring to it in too narrow a sense. They see it in terms of what we call worldwide globalization. And that has to do with the interdependencies in a complex socioeconomic system. And this particular bias interpretation developed after the collapse of the Iron Curtain in Europe, and the disintegration of the Soviet bloc. And then people, started claiming that the United States had become had built such a powerful economic hegemony, and the capitalist system was taking the world all over. And people, especially economists, thought that that was the beginning of globalization in that sense, but it isn't. You can go all the way back to the Roman Empire or to the Hellenic Empire, and you can invoke globalization. It's all relative to what the world is to people at that particular time, and how far that world goes. But the other thing that is, I think, more significant is the state interpretation of globalization as condition of interconnectedness in a socioeconomic network. And this is when you can think of globalization in as regionally or locally more contained, because in especially the developed countries, you see a number of interdependencies. Take, for instance, when people have to erect a new building, what happens? The people that dig the foundations are not the people that are going to erect the building. And the people that come at some time to put the utility pipes and so forth, they are in a different business. The people that will eventually work on windows and so forth, they are also in a different business. And where language becomes particularly relevant to this interpretation of globalization is that if you don't speak the same language you are likely to have a lot of problems. And you see another example of this, for instance, I think there was a tragedy in the 1980s with a space shuttle that exploded soon after launch. And people wanted to find out what caused that accident. And it turned out that no fewer than 900 companies had contributed to building the space shuttle. And any one of those companies could have been responsible for what had happened. And it took a long time before people could discover what had happened. This is where you can also speak of globalization, especially because in this sense, the companies didn't even operate in the same country. Okay. And we have heard of outsourcing. That is also part of that globalization. And what I'm going to talk about is globalization at the local level as being more relevant to the vitality of languages, that is to questions of language endangerment and loss. But not only that, the questions of language resilience, languages that continue to be spoken despite the pressure that comes on the speaker from the fact that they are inserted in this kind of global economy. And globalization needed amount to what in French is designated as mondialisation, because that focuses too much on the whole world as if the whole world was integrated. One of the things I want to highlight here is that at some point people started saying English is becoming the dominant language around the world and you can travel everywhere and you'll get service. That's not been my experience. One time I was in Brazil, in a city called Belo Horizonte, and I was alone and wanted to order lunch, and nobody at that restaurant spoke English, so I had to rely on pictures to order my meal. Or I went to a store and wanted to buy a piece of clothing, and I had the same problem. The salesperson couldn't speak English. And you come across these cases in many parts of the world. I went to Shanghai one time, and I saw something actually very interesting. The scholars that had invited me spoke very little English or didn't want to speak it, as I found out later. And then I went to a market, and people, women working at the market were very fluent in English, and they would ask me, I could communicate with them more easily than I could communicate with the scholars that had invited me. Okay. So there are a number of things that go on with globalization and mondialization that are not consistent with what the books have been telling us about the effects of globalization. And for me, I'm focusing primarily on the local, regional aspects of globalization and not on worldwide globalization. Although many of the things that we experience at the local level may have been triggered by worldwide globalization. And I refer to this aspect, globalization, a little bit differently from what you can find in the literature. But for me, globalization is a convenient term for globalization at the local level. And globalization has been claimed to homogenize the world, making it less diverse. But how true is it? Again, when you travel, people tell you, you go to Tokyo, you'll find a Hilton hotel. And so it's more and more American-like. Check in the hotel, you'll see that the room is decorated differently, not in the American style. The size of the room is not in the American style. The decorations are not in the American style. And you go to the hotel's restaurant for breakfast, you don't get the same kind of service. And it has been claimed to be a recent phenomenon. I already spoke about that. What is different is the speed of globalization, the complexity of globalization, because there are more factors involved, and the geographical extent of the phenomenon with its emergence. And globalization has been associated with English, with McDonald's, with Hollywood movies, and saying that the English language is the agent of globalization, that McDonald's eateries are agents of globalization, and Hollywood movies are agents of globalization. It's the other way around. It's globalization that have enabled English, the McDonald's and Hollywood movies to become global. Okay. And if you pay attention, Hollywood movies, when they are released, at least in many countries where the economy is strong, they are not released in English. And I remember one time in Paris, the movie The Butler had been just released. And Cecile and I went to the movie theater, but we didn't see the English version, we saw the French version of it. Okay, so this is just to tell you that things are not operating exactly the same way, even under the umbrella of globalization around the world. Urbanization is another story too. Okay, so you can interpret urbanization in a number of ways. So the first is the development into an agglomeration larger than a village. And an agglomeration that is endowed with a life infrastructure more complex and better structured than those typical of rural areas. When a village or small town grows larger and acquires an infrastructure similar to that of a city, we can also speak of urbanization. But population growth is not enough. It must be accompanied by a particular kind of infrastructure that enables the residents to live comfortably, to earn a living, to move around, to have health care, and all sorts of services that must be provided by an urban structure. So it is possible for a town or a city to evolve into.
Okay.
Somebody speaking. Into what is, I learned the term in Kinshasa.
Yes.
Colleagues, somebody else is speaking. Yeah, I learned in Kinshasa, colleagues told me Kinshasa is, nous parlons maintenant de urbanisation. The urbanization, disurbanization, and that is, Kinshasa looks less and less like a city, and it's turning more and more into a village-like agglomeration. Okay. Although the population of Kinshasa has mushroomed since independence. In other words, the city infrastructure is collapsing. And several African cities are actually a combination of both urban centers and mega villages. As you can tell from this picture, you have the town center and the structures change. And as you move away from the town center, things look less and less urban. It's not enough to have a concrete walls and a tin roof to say that the place has urbanized. Okay, now let's see things from the beginnings before I shouldn't say from the beginning, but things in pre-colonial times. And there are historians among you that may correct me. But what I want to highlight here is that things have changed quite a bit since the colonial period. Before, Africa had its own political institutions, but only a few centralized states and a multiplicity of chieftainships. So the spaces, can you see my arrow, my pointer? The spaces that are outside these circles, it does not mean that those spaces were uninhabited. Those spaces were inhabited, with the difference that they consisted just of villages living separately, and each village with its own political structure to coordinate activities among the people. But there were clusters of empires or kingdoms in some parts of Africa that succeeded each other or coexisted with each other, more of them in West Africa and fewer of them in Central Africa. And Congo is there, you can see it on the map. And what would happen with colonization is, first of all, the disintegration of these empires and kingdoms and motion into a different kind of regime, administrative structure. But the other thing I want to highlight is that Africa was already participating in a global network of trade before the Europeans started colonizing Africa, first on the trade model and later on the exploitation model. So there is the trans-Saharan trade that involved trading with the Arabs in the north, but there was also trade in Central Africa. And in the case of the Congo, the town on Manyanga became so significant in our discussions in linguistics because it became a station that the Europeans could connect with the coast. And there's another reason why I wanted to project this other map here. You pay attention, a lot of these empires and kingdoms, they are not coastal. Very few of them are. Congo, the Congo kingdom is a kind of exception to being partly on the coast, but the activities of the trade were in the interior, and except for East Africa, where the Arabs, and that's where we have Swahili, traded with indigenous African populations along the coast before the Europeans even arrived. And then in the 15th century, we have two major maritime powers in Europe that, after surviving colonization by the Arabs and the Moors for 7 centuries, decided to find alternative routes to the spices where they had come from in Asia. And so on the one side, you have the Portuguese and a pope at the Treaty of Tordesillas, I think in 1474, 1470, sometime in the 15th century, split the world into two halves. The part in green allocated to Portugal and the part in brown allocated to Spain. So that was the beginning of the expansion of globalization from the smaller sizes of globalization during the Roman Empire, and from the part of globalization that was associated with the Silk Road, all the way from China to Anatolia, where Turkey is now, to something that really start becoming worldwide globalization, literally, because more parts of the world were included. And we often speak of the triangular trade in which Africa participated. But that is only part of the story, because Africa was at that time at the center, or one of the centers of globalization, because the triangular trade was actually part of the trade that was coming from India. The Portuguese led in this particular kind of trade, and they traded goods with African states, and then took goods from African states to Europe or to the Americas. And this is how Africa fits in this kind of trade. Europe at that time was not as developed as it is now. Europe has benefited from these contacts with Africa and the rest of the world. A whole lot of the impressive structures we find in Europe and so forth are consequences of this engagement with Africa and with other parts of the world. If anything, we have to ask, what did African rulers do with what they gained? Okay. So by the beginning of the 21st century, as you can see, and I took this from a magazine in Paris, Africa is becoming more and more marginalized in the global network of exchanges. Most of the traffic is between Europe and North America, between East Asia and North America, between North America and South America. The traffic between Africa and Europe and the traffic between Africa and the Americas is very small. So Africa becomes more and more marginalized. That means that a whole lot of things that are happening in the world that may be associated with worldwide globalization are not really impacting Africa as the other parts of the world. That's part of it. And so this is again an aspect of that globalization. And red here stands for nations that are in the periphery of the actual economic globalization. Most of Africa, with the exception of South Africa. Okay, and the darkest blue, that is the countries. People have been speaking of pluricentrism in modern globalization. And interestingly, most of Africa doesn't figure in there. And when you see it in terms of wealth, the size of Africa shrinks to a ridiculous size compared to Australia and compared to the United States or to Japan. Okay. So you put it in terms of urbanization, Africa also looks so different. Most of the urbanization with solid infrastructure to support the population that lives in the city is found outside Africa. Again, some exceptions. And then Libya, that is quite interesting because most of the population is on the coast anyway, and that can explain why there is such a high concentration. Now, a satellite picture just shows us again to what extent Africa is really within the periphery of modern globalization. The lights show which parts of the world are quite developing, and has an Africa been referred to as the dark continent? So you see some lights here near Cape Town and Johannesburg, but the rest of Africa then closer to Saudi Arabia, but Europe and the United States. Latin America is somewhere between Africa and the United States in terms of development. And then you go and look, and you're going to find Singapore here that clusters with the other groups, but not so much. Australia is an interesting case because a whole lot of Australia is a desert and so forth. So just by looking at a map like this, you get to think more about inequities, diversity, variation around the world. And so we cannot try to generalize from what we observe in the West to draw conclusions that are inaccurate about language development in Africa. Okay, and one must recognize the African exceptionalism in this case. It was sparked by the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and it's the Industrial Revolution that led to the colonization of Africa on the exploitation model, because before that there was the kind of colonization that involved only the Portuguese for a long time, but then by the 17th century, France, Belgium, I shouldn't put it that way. France, Holland, and England became more interested in engaging in trade with Africa until the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution was gaining steam. But after the the United States Revolution, but also after many of the American countries were getting independence, and then people thought we better colonize Africa on a different model so that we can get enough raw materials to fuel the Industrial Revolution. So colonization actually, people try to justify by saying we have to civilize the dark continent, we have to civilize the primitive people and so forth, but it was much less for civilizing anybody, if they could do it, than for exploiting the land and getting raw materials to develop Europe and to develop the Western world. And it has remained on the margins of worldwide globalization. That is, since the late 18th century, all the way to date, it's been one thing or another that just would push Africa further and further towards the periphery of globalization and away from an important position that it had in up to the late 18th century in the global trade. And Africa has also been badly hit by natural disasters, wars, and refugee migrations. And I will argue these are the factors that have been playing a more important role about the endangerment of some languages than being connected to the rest of the world through the network of globalization. So how has Africa survived? You know, we have experts like Cecile Vigouroux in the audience that will tell you Africa has survived essentially thanks to vernacular economy. Call it informal economy if you want. Okay, because formal economy in Africa, industrialization, all that has either degenerated or stagnated, while population growth has been on the increase, and the resources for earning a living become more and more limited, and people survive through informal economy. You see the women selling things at the market, see the mode of transportation to get money and what people are selling. And what does the informal, what language does the informal economy operate in? It's not French. It's not Lingala everywhere. It's not Kituba everywhere. A lot of people use ethnic languages. Those ethnic languages have been supporting the trade economy, by the trade economy, informal economy, but informal economy has also sustained the indigenous languages. How? You go to the market like this, if you speak Lingala and you are in Bandundu, you get to pay more. If you are in Bagata, where I'm from, you have to pay more if you speak Lingala. If you speak French, you may not get service, or you even pay much more than the person speaking Lingala. And what has happened? The Chinese has learned it in Kinshasa. You don't sell in Lingala. You don't sell in French. You have to sell your goods in Lingala. And go to Kinshasa, you'll find a lot of Chinese that speak Lingala fluently. More fluently than Belgians that had been living in Kinshasa for much longer. Okay, it's a matter of practicality and so forth. And the other thing that you can find, there are supermarkets now, but there are traditional markets too. But guess where people go and get most of their food? Not at the modern supermarket. They go to this market because things are more affordable, because you can bargain the price, and you cannot do it there. The affluent people that have domestics, what language do they use to talk to their domestics? They can use French, but that increases the chances of being misunderstood by your domestic that speaks little French. You are better off speaking Lingala in Kinshasa or Kikongo in Bandundu. And if it is the domestic that is going to buy the food, well, then the domestic either goes to the traditional market on their own, or is encouraged to go to the traditional market, because that's an opportunity to save money, and the language in this market is not French. You know, there are places like Lubumbashi where people love French so much, you can talk to a market lady in French, but I guarantee that the person that does the transaction in Swahili gets cheaper service than the person that does the transaction in French. Okay, so this is just to tell us, to remind us that the way in which we behave economically contributes to the vitality of the indigenous languages in Africa. And the pressure, there is little pressure in Africa for people to change, shift languages and give up the indigenous languages, although we fear this in urban centers where children are more invested in the urban vernacular Lingala than in the ethnic languages. But they also develop, a lot of them develop passive knowledge of the ethnic languages, which they can put into use when they are really challenged, because that becomes very helpful. The other reason why the indigenous languages in Africa are not so much threatened is transportation. It's very difficult to travel long distances in the Congo. And the pictures tell you the story. And so people occasionally come to the city and then they are stuck in the city, but where are they going to live? In the part of the city that I can characterize as a mega village, but not in the town center. And in the mega village, the patterns of interaction the patterns of socialization are not the same as in the town center, because a lot of people cluster together depending on whether or not they are members of the same family or came from the same village. And what do among themselves? They speak the indigenous languages, even in Kinshasa. But we have a tradition of multilingualism. If you travel, you must be invested in learning the language of the destination. So everybody can speak Lingala in the public sphere, especially if they are interacting with people of a different ethno-linguistic group. But when it comes to traditional practices, like a wedding, like celebrating something related to children, or consulting people that practice traditional medicine, you are better off speaking your ethnic language. The assumption is you get better service that way, but certainly not French in these particular kinds of circumstances. Okay. And despite rural exodus and the steady gulf between the urban and the rural areas, the demographic expansion of cities is not a concomitant of urbanization. And that is what we have to remember. Okay. When people travel, move around in Kinshasa like this or like that, just listen to them. Not everybody is speaking Lingala. And the people that are talking with each other, if they are neighbors but from different ethno-linguistic backgrounds, yes, they are speaking Lingala. But if they are from the same ethno-linguistic background, and they may have migrated to Kinshasa just during the past 20 years or so, chances are that you will hear these people speak the ethnic language rather than Lingala. And what actually keeps these ethnic languages alive even in Kinshasa and other urban centers is that people leave the rural areas in hope to find employment in the city, and they arrive in the city and there aren't any jobs available, and they have to survive on informal economy. And the people that practice informal economy, they practice it primarily among themselves. And the language is the language that bonds them. And that language is the ethnic language and not the urban vernacular. When there is a funeral, people come and they sympathize with each other, and they do it in the ethnic language and not in Lingala. Those are occasions when you actually see speakers of Lingala being chastised for not speaking the ethnic language, because that is part of the tradition that they should have maintained. Okay. I used to think that places like Kinshasa were the cemeteries of ethnic languages, and that's where the ethnic languages start to die, until I returned to Kinshasa in 2008 and attended a funeral and a number of traditional ceremonies, and I was struck by the extent to which people prefer socializing in the ethnic languages. The support system among the economically disenfranchised are run in the ethnic languages and not in the urban vernaculars, unless there is no other way. So the linguistic legacy, what is the linguistic legacy of European colonization? Unlike in settler colonies like the United States or Canada, the colonizers in Africa trained colonial auxiliaries, the precursors of today's ruling class, to interface between them, that is the Europeans, and the masses of the indigenous people. Okay. The colonial auxiliaries learned to speak the relevant colonial languages, today's official languages, for interfacing and interfacing between the Europeans and the majority of the disenfranchised and colonized Africans, or as a lingua franca of the elite. So yes, Africa was colonized through interpreters, and it is still ruled through interpreters, so much so that our political leaderships, assert the status in French in the case of the Congo and not in indigenous languages. And the one person that really tried to connect with the population in indigenous languages was Mobutu, President Mobutu. But he did it with the purpose of, he was a real demagogue, with the purpose of just hiding everything bad that he was doing against the interests of the people. Okay. A number of politicians have tried to do that, but less successfully than he did. Okay. But otherwise, the colonization of Africa took place through interpreters, and our leaders are still doing it through interpreters. So people at the higher level of the structure operate in French, and people at the lower level of the structure communicate with the rest of the population in indigenous languages. What is interesting in offices in Kinshasa, when you go there, you can start in French, and then you want to connect better with the people in the administration, you try Lingala. And if you discover that the person speaks your ethnic language, you talk to the person in your ethnic language. In the courts, in the judicial system, you still have a reporter that transcribes the reports of the trials in French, but the people that are being that came to court are speaking either an indigenous language or the urban vernaculars and so forth. So what we wind up having is this division of labor for the different languages. It's not that one language is going to take to be used in all social domains, is that there is a language for the higher level of administration, for higher education and so forth. There is a language that you use when you are socializing with people from your own ethnic background, and a language that you use to communicate with other people that are not from your ethnic background, but that language is not necessarily French. And there are different domains of interaction, and different domains call for different languages. So the masses of the population, the demographic majorities that are disenfranchised, have been minoritized economically and politically, pushed to the margins. And most of these people are also rural, but those in the cities are still majorities, and they socialize in indigenous languages. Take it this way. Africa has been independent for over 60 years now, and a lot of the education is imparted in the European language. But on average, people estimate that only 20% of the African population can speak these European languages comfortably, with the exception of Gabon and Angola. And Gabon didn't develop a major indigenous language as a lingua franca, and Angola for another reason, especially the protracted war of independence in Angola, where Portuguese actually worked as a lingua franca against the independence fighters. And South Africa is a special case, but in South Africa, there is a substantial white population, especially, I think about 10% of the population. And there is a shortage of jobs for which knowledge of the European languages is required. So because the formal economy remains underdeveloped. Socialization, which is quite often intra-ethnic, but typically among indigenous people, does not require knowledge of the European language. There is a small elite that still uses French in the Congo to socialize among themselves, but more and more people feel better and more at ease socializing in Lingala or in Swahili than in French. In the city, socialization is often in the urban vernacular, which also functions as a regional lingua franca, but socialization proceeds in ethnic languages among adults, especially at events that are associated with cultural heritage, the cultural heritage of the participants. Africans value egalitarian multilingualism. In other words, the different languages that are really on a par. The difference is you have to know which language to use in which context, but there is no language that a person wants to just apply to operate with in the different spheres of the interaction. Africans value equality, yes, and Africans maintain the ethnic languages for heritage and cultural practices. But it is also, if you are part of the elite and you speak just French, and you are driving a used car and it breaks down, and you cannot afford to take the car to the normal car dealer, you go to a dépanneur, and you get better service if you speak the same language as the dépanneur. And it doesn't work well for you if you speak French, because you're going to pay more, but because you are not like one of them that is enfranchised that are acting as the dépanneur, and they may very well take advantage of you. So one way of bonding with other people, even if you belong in the elite class, is to revert to an indigenous language, be it the lingua franca or an ethnic language, but certainly not French. And we have an extended family system that remains in place. And we accommodate members of the extended family when they visit us in the city, or when we go to the village to reconnect with our heritage. And there is a lot of pressure, especially when we return to the village, to speak the indigenous language, or to do one's best to speak in an indigenous language, because otherwise you are derided for having forgotten your heritage. Unlike in the Western world, the proportion of rural populations is higher than the urban ones. In terms of economic development, the cultural contrast between the rural and urban environment the cultural contrast between the rural and the urban environments is still striking, although several urbanites have maintained their heritage cultural practices. So I already told you the thing in the third bullet. I went to Kinshasa and I had to change my mind in 2008 about the way that we were talking about language endangerment. There are nonetheless cases owing to natural disasters or refugees when an ethnic language may endanger another one beyond the traditional displacement of the Pygmies, the Khoi, and the San languages by those of the Bantu invaders, and Kern in the audience can explain this better. And one of the things that I learned from Kern's work is asymmetry, for instance, in terms of marriages, because people cross ethno-linguistic boundaries in marriages, and the Bantu men can marry Khoi or San women, but it is less frequent in the opposite direction. And that too can contribute to the endangerment of the Khoi and San languages. And of course, when the Dutch colonized the area, you know, a number of disasters happened between the Dutch and the Khoi and the San, and a number of San languages were driven to extinction by those contacts. But in reading the literature carefully, there are more cases of Khoi and San languages that have been endangered by Bantu languages and not by European languages. And in the case of the Pygmy, it's entirely the effect of the contact with between the Bantu and the Pygmy populations that drove the indigenous Pygmy languages to extinction. And that's how we have to look at it. And so, but when you put things in the larger picture, the Pygmies, the Khoi, and the San people, these are people that had been treated as inferior by the Bantu populations. And whatever is going on there, we have to study this more carefully to explain why, you know, the Bantu have had such a negative impact on the more indigenous languages spoken by the Pygmies, the Khoi, and the Sans, but not relative to each other, except in the cases of natural disaster where one population leaves the village and goes and lives in another village, and because they mix, then the population that moved to the other village is likely to lose their language. That happens, but there are few such cases. On the other end, with all the wars in Africa, one thing that we have to pay attention to with the refugees that migrate to other places, what happens to their languages. So I remember in the 1970s in Kinshasa, there were clusters of Bazombo from Angola, and they lived there and had children there. Many of them stayed there for over 20 years or so. And these people, they wound up becoming Lingala speakers, or if they interacted with Bakongo, they wound up also becoming speakers of some of these languages, but lost their heritage language. When they migrated back to Angola, it was a problem with integrating in the Angola population because they had lost control of this. About 10 years ago, or was it maybe 15 years ago, I went to a restaurant here in Chicago with Johannes Fabian, and we were eating, and I took him to a Nigerian restaurant, and we were eating, and a couple of tables away from us, we had people speak Lingala, and we said, let's go talk to them. And we thought they were Congolese, but they were Angolans. Where did they learn Lingala? In Kinshasa. But this was, you know, at the time that I just described to you, these people had been refugees in the Congo, and because they had grown there, their primary language became Lingala rather than any of the Angolan languages. Okay, so there are differences in population structures, and we cannot generalize too fast from what we have learned about language endangerment in the Western world and extrapolate it to Africa, except in the case of Pygmy, Khoi, and San languages. There haven't been many for that reasons, for the reasons that many cases of language endangerment in Africa for the reasons that I just presented in the previous part. In some cases, as in Kinshasa and Dakar, one may speculate that European official languages are endangered. So the domains in which French used to be used as the language of prestige are contracting in Kinshasa and in Dakar. I was actually struck 2 years ago when I was in Dakar and met colleagues there. When they talk to each other in my presence, they would speak Wolof and use French only in speaking to me, and which was for me an indication they actually socialize more in Wolof than they do in French. And I have heard that there are some students at the university in Kinshasa that earn a living in translating class notes into Lingala for colleagues that don't speak enough Lingala when they are admitted to college. Okay. So cases of language endangerment and loss are far more limited in Africa than in the Americas and Australia. The current cases are associated with natural disasters and refugees. Kituba is not endangered, and apparently not the various languages of the Congo cluster like many other ethnic languages. That is really my position, and you can ask me questions about it. There is a recent publication by Birgit Riquier, maybe that's the pronunciation, with some colleagues of hers at the University of Kisangani about language endangerment in northeastern Congo. And what they report is a lot of languages are spoken by small populations. But these languages are still resilient. They are not dying yet. The literature that we read tells us if a language is spoken by a small population because of pressures of globalization, that language is likely to be endangered. Not so easy. There is such a thing as population structure. If people live in conditions similar to the pre-colonial Africa, well, then the villages are self-contained and people operate in informal economy, and that informal economy sustains the language. If they have to trade goods with other populations, they learn the other language, but only for their transactions and not to use it as their vernaculars and so forth. It takes a different kind of population structure for a small language to be endangered. And that will take me another lecture to explain, but the main difference is that colonization, settlement colonization was culturally assimilationist, and that is what has driven language endangerment and loss. Whereas exploitation colonization created a hierarchy of languages with a division of labor among the languages. And as long as every language keeps its domain of use, then there is no fear that any language is going to be endangered. So this is just a map to show how Africa colonized the region where the Pygmies and the Khoi and San languages disappeared. And the main reason for this particular evolutionary trajectory of Africa is unfortunately lack of economic development. In addition to the fact that the European colonization of Africa, continued by the current political leadership, was not culturally assimilationist. And what really matters for language is captured well by the French saying, "La langue doit nourrir son nom," and that remains true. And the indigenous languages have been maintained primarily by informal economy and the continued practice of heritage cultures, despite Christianization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sari. in fact, you have responded to many of our my concerns. We have a tradition in this platform to start with our Mbota. Professor John Janzen, just a word MacGaffey, I don't know if White is there, and we've got John Janzen is there. John, do you have some questions, please? Or some comments?
Yes, I do have a question. I think this is very inspiring and generally upbeat for Kikongo connoisseurs and advocates of African language. I have a question about my observation from the early post-colonial period to more recently, the disappearance of print material in the Kikongo realm and general absence of newspapers and new books and so on. At the same time, the rise of cell phones and video and TV. So, as an expert on the relationship of formal language, colonial language to African languages, how would you advocate for the promotion of educational and cultural materials? You've stressed the informal sector, informal economy, and so forth of the driver of much language development and heritage activity, but let's say you were placed in the situation of the Ministry of Education of an African country. What kind of language materials would you promote, and how would you do this? General question, I think.
That is a very perceptive question, and I'm struck by the fact that you didn't take your question in the direction that I expected to hear in linguistics. And that is, without print material, how can you sustain a language? And your question just avoided that, because that's the wrong way to deal with it. If I were to become a minister of education, I think the first thing would be for me to fight with the Minister of Economic Development, because you have to develop the economy in order to develop education. People lead us to believe that you develop a language first, and then from there you can use the language in the economy. Not so. During the colonial period, actually what happened is that despite all the exploitation of Africa and so forth, there was some investment in education and some investment in the blue collar sector of the economy. Okay. And there was print material. I remember Librairie Saint Paul in Kinshasa. I used to go and find books there when I arrived in Kinshasa in the 1970s. I went back in 2008. The shelves were depleted and so forth. The economy is collapsing and you are not going to get there. Mm-hmm. So it's not enough to tell people, okay, we are going to teach you in Kikongo, we are going to teach you in Lingala and so forth. You need a global solution. Speaking of globalization, you need a global solution. You need to pay teachers better wages. You need a good physical infrastructure for education. You need an economy that can support printing of materials for schools. You need a lot of money to do a lot of things for a decent education. And you don't just insist on the language alone, okay? And when you approach things globally like that, which means reducing corruption in the administration of our countries, then you can answer your question. We can answer your question. Otherwise, we will go nowhere.
I hear you.
Again, the same principle, la langue doit nourrir son nom.
I don't see Wyatt here, but Bob, just do you have any question? Just if you have questions, please. Bob, do you have one? We prefer to give to our Mbuta or elders. Bob was born in Vanga. Yes, and
no, not born in Vanga. Born in Kikongo on the Wamba. Yeah. Well, I don't have a question right in my head, top of my head. So you should pass it on to others who are already prepared to ask a question.
Thank you very much. Just go ahead, please.
President Mutu Yankaka.
Thank you. Now, Diane, do you have a question? And I know that Professor Matuka is there. Just Didier Gondola, just please. Just if you have a question.
Yeah, I have a question. This is Didier. Maybe a comment first. This was a very brilliant and really a tour de force, we would say in French, very encompassing, using globalization as the point of entry to look at the status of indigenous and heritage languages in Africa and especially in Congo. But my comment is first to take issue with your characterization of Africa as being on the margins of worldwide globalization. That's what you said. And I think it's what I try to convey to my students is actually the contrary. It's just the opposite, that it depends really on how you define center and periphery. For me, Africa has been at the center. Africa has been the core of globalization. And without Africa, globalization wouldn't have happened. So the main linchpin of what moved globalization forward was Africa because of its resources, because of its position, because of its people, and so on. If it weren't for Africa, Europe would remain the peninsula of Asia, a very negligible continent. So in a very Fanonian vein, I would say that Europe owes much, not just Europe, but the West owes much to Africa. For me, Africa has remained very much at the center of this idea of globalization. I came a little late and didn't really see the articulation between globalization and heritage languages, but I understand that you are basically, what I take from your talk is that there is hope for What I take away from your talk is that there is hope for indigenous languages. You mentioned transportation in Congo, because there is really no long distance transportation. There's no connection between the different areas. So those heritage languages remain very vibrant because of that. You also mentioned the informal economy, which to some degree sustains those indigenous languages. What you did, and I understand towards the end of your talk, you basically say that it seems to you like it is rather European languages that are endangered in Congo or in Africa in general, and not the African languages or the indigenous languages. What about popular culture? You really didn't mention popular culture with respect to indigenous languages, because it seems to me that when we look at popular culture, we really see that there is, as Dr. Luc Facile had said in her dissertation, that when we look at the popular culture's music, we look at religion and so on, it seems like those main vernacular languages, like Lingala, for example, become really kind of the killer languages, really kind of killing the indigenous languages within the realm of popular culture, which is something that I think is really missing for your tour de force, from your presentation. Could you elaborate on that? Did you also look at popular culture with respect to those heritage languages?
Right, it's just an omission. by omission that I didn't speak of popular culture. As you see, there are so many things that one can bring into this discussion, and the time is limited. The thing about popular culture is that, you know, we love our urban vernaculars for popular culture, but there's also that division of labor. So a person sings in Lingala, but socializes in another language. You find this, for instance, in Bandutu. You can hear people produce music in Lingala, but they don't socialize in Lingala. The division of labor. But the other thing you're going to find out is that along with the so-called popular culture, there is also a growth of traditional music to celebrate heritage. So more and more you hear music that comes from Gimbala, for instance, in Bandundu, or Pende in Bandundu, and you'll pay attention to all these bands, especially the young ones. Many of them are using indigenous, Lingala is indigenous too. They are using ethnic language to celebrate their ethnic heritage. So there is a competition going on. But the question is, where are you going to hear the music in ethnic languages, and where are you going to hear the music in the urban vernaculars?
But are you defining that music in those ethnic languages as popular music? Because my question was really related to popular music.
That's right.
I don't know if they have the status of popular music, if the music is in Pende and the music is basically just performed in that area in the province. It doesn't really, we
question,
can't really label that popular music.
You hear this music in Kinshasa. You go and find people in particular celebrations. People are going to town in this ethnic music. But the other thing, what all I want to highlight is that all these things are happening at the same time. And the fact that because of the division of labor among the languages, if a person wants to become a big musician in the Congo, obviously they better know Kinshasa, they better know Lingala, even if they live in the Swahili-speaking area. On the other hand, something is happening in the Swahili-speaking area. There is more and more music in Swahili because they can also export that music to neighboring Swahili-speaking countries and so forth. So as long as we are within this system of division of labor, a language has a function in its particular cultural domain. There is really no case of one language endangering another language. But and you are right, these things are really spreading, but they are spreading in different directions too. With the question of globalization, you see it, if you look at it as you seem to do from the point of view of materials being exported from Africa for the development of the West and so forth. Yes, Africa is the center. But if you look at it in terms of how wealth is being developed from the resources taken out of Africa, you look at that from the point of view of who determines the value, the values of the different commodities and so forth, who determines how you are going to pay for the manufactured goods that have been produced in the West and come back to Africa, and Africans cannot afford those goods and those commodities, then that explains the picture that I painted. It's a matter of what kind of power you have in the dynamics of worldwide globalization, and things are terribly asymmetrical in that particular regard, and that is what I focus on. And that's why I showed Africa as a continuation of the colonial regime, or what, in my interpretation, you are better qualified to judge this. In my interpretation, Africa acquired political independence, but not economic independence. And when it comes to the economy, Africa has remained a supplier of raw materials to the West and so forth. And Africa is still under the exploitation colonization model. And excuse me for being unpleasant to our politicians, I treat them as servants of European patrons. Okay, so it's like there were auxiliaries during the colonial period, but the auxiliaries have become the rulers. But the rulers are still there, except they are no longer inside the country, they are outside the country.
Thank you.
Wow.
You are
Wow.
welcome.
Professor Yudi Robert is here. Just Professor Yudi Robert was the facilitator of the fat George Foreman and Ali, and he was the just director of one of departments in UNESCO in Paris. He's with us here, and he's the person who just some years ago brought to my attention just how Kikongo was disappearing just in Lower Congo. And in fact, he told me that, Adrien, I think that Kikongo will become like what Latin is to French today. And that's really what I stated to me some years ago. Professor Yudi Robert, just from Paris, do you have any question, please? Do you have any comment? Just Professor Yudi speaks English very well, and he's among the first Congolese intellectuals who came to this country to study. There he is. Professor Yudi, est-ce que vous avez une question, professeur? Prof. Yudi Robert? Okay, just before he, okay.
Maybe I can comment on that since he's not speaking.
Uh-huh.
You know, there are interesting.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I cannot tell you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Very sorry.
Okay.
So what happens, and Professor Gondola can also speak to this. For instance, when I call my relatives in the Congo. The younger ones who want to impress me how well they have been doing in school, they speak to me in French. The people that grew up with me, they want to see if I have forgotten Kikongo or Kiansi. Incidentally, Kikongo, people in Bandundu can speak of Kikongo. That's how we call Kikongo Kituba. And people in Bakongo, I don't think that they can really speak of Kikongo. They think of Kiyombe, they think of Sundi, Kingombe, and all those varieties. So they are more specific about those things. But people want to find out if I still speak Kikongo. People want to find out if I still speak Kiansi, and I apologize for not speaking Kiansi to them. But this is really what happens. And then when you visit in person, okay, the first test, people want to find out whether you are going to communicate to them in French, whether you have forgotten French or can speak and speak only English. But as you leave Kinshasa and go further in the interior, and in my case in Bandundu, then people wanted to root me back in. And they want to root me back in speaking to me in Kiansi. And so much so that what happened to me, the first time I went back in 1984, 2 weeks later, somebody talked to me and told me, you learned very fast. And I asked, what do you mean I learned very fast? Oh, now you speak Kiyansi like us. And I said, what do you mean I speak Kiyansi like you? I left the place here speaking Kiyansi, and I came back 10 years later speaking Kiyansi. And the guy said, no, man, when you came back, you spoke Kiyansi like a white man. So, in other words, just, consistent with this idea of division of labor, X language for X context, Y language for Y context, and Z language for Z context, and so forth. People really have things well compartmentalized. It does not mean that the division is really clear cut. There is a lot of overlap, but people do have choices, and the choices they make define how they want to relate to you. Okay, this is really what is happening there. And these are the dynamics that are keeping our languages alive. And it's contrary to what we find here in the United States or in Europe. Actually, the other thing I want to point out is that I have seen Congolese in Belgium and in France, and they socialize among themselves in Lingala or Kikongo or the like. They don't do it in French, although they often also want to show how much French they have learned. It's like François Fanon would have said, they want to speak French better than the French themselves, okay? But even the people that fall in the category of the elite, because there are different Congolese going to Europe, people that fall in the category of the elite, when they want to socialize with the other people that don't fit that category, that's when they shift to Lingala or Kikongo and so forth, because the purpose is to establish a social connection with the person. It's not just simple communication. We use different languages, not necessarily to, not only to transfer information to other people, to not only to communicate with other people, but also to establish some sort of bonding with other people. And the language you choose defines how you are going to bond with each other.
Wendy just has an observation from Congo Central. Wendy, please ask your question. The time is distance, just will be done very soon. Wendy, please go ahead, ask your question.
Hey, good morning. First of all, I thoroughly enjoyed Professor Boston's presentation a few weeks ago, and also Professor Mufwene's presentation today. I worked as an American Baptist missionary in Zaire, Congo, I call it, I put both names together, because I went there in 1983 and retired in 2012. So I saw the transition between Zaire and Congo.
Yes.
And I worked most of the time in Kimpese, Congo Central right now, at Ipe Epi Seko Université Protestante de Kimpese, whichever time that you happen to be familiar with that place. During that time, I observed a change from people talking among themselves, especially children. At first, the children would talk to each other in Kikongo, but then the last few years, children playing, whatever they were doing, were speaking Lingala much more. And the question came to me, obviously these children also speak Kikongo because they speak it with their parents. But when they have children and grandchildren, what language will they be speaking? And I am with those who say that possibly Kikongo, at least in the melting pot of Kimpese, I don't know whether people will be speaking Kikongo or Lingala with their children. And regarding I don't think French is disappearing. I don't think French will be diminished as long as the government of the Congo has to be in French. And that's mainly because among the competing languages in the Congo, who would ever agree to one of the other languages being the dominant language in government? I can't see Kikongo, Lingala, Swahili, or Chiluba becoming the dominant language in government because there would be too much opposition among the people who are governing. I had great difficulty learning Kikongo, and one of the reasons was the different types of Kikongo that were being spoken there. I had a helper who was from Manyanga, another helper who was Mundibu, and as soon as I would try to use a word that I had learned, someone would say, "Oh, that's Kimanyanga. You don't speak that. That's from North."
Right.
So there was
That John.
Yeah.
maybe they were teasing, but it still affected my.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because anytime I tried to speak Kikongo, I would get, put down in a sense.
Yeah.
And then I think it was enriching to me. All of my work was done in French. I taught at the Bible Institute there and a little bit at a high school. But then I was able to visit a couple in 2019, both children of pastors, one from Manyanga, one from Mayombe. And I visited them in their home in the US in 2019. They have 4 children. And I observed that these 2 very good Kikongophone people, when they spoke to each other in the kitchen or whatever, I was waiting for them to get dinner ready. When they spoke to each other, they spoke in Lingala. I said, "Hey, what are you? 2 very good from 2 Kikongo speaking families. Why are you speaking in Lingala to each other?"
Yeah.
And they spoke mostly to me in French. But, and it might be because the Kikongo, they didn't give me an answer, but maybe their languages were different enough that they felt more comfortable speaking in Lingala. But my limited observation would show that Kikongo, the use of Kikongo in Congo Central is diminishing in favor of Lingala. So
Yeah.
I don't know. That's my 2 cents worth. But thank you very much.
Okay.
I think Sally.
Wendy is very perceptive of you. I just want to ask you, did you also learn to speak Lingala?
I spent about 3 years in Lingala and took some classes, but my knowledge of Lingala is very limited as well.
Did your helpers know that you didn't speak Lingala well?
My helpers?
Yeah, the people that spoke Lingala in the kitchen.
I knew that they knew that I recognized that it was Lingala, and I could understand some of what they were saying. My biggest problem was in my ears, and I don't know why.
Yeah, what I wanted to suggest, that they may have been intending to keep you out of what they were talking about. This happened to Gustav Hulster, who encouraged the study of Lingala in the Congo, and so he had developed this theory about Lingala being the language spoken all the way from Kinshasa up to Mbandaka and beyond. And then something happened by accident. There was fire in a convent, and the nuns that were in this convent, while they were hustling to get everybody safe and so forth, realized that the people that they had been working with and interacting with in Lingala spoke to each other in another language. And then after the disaster, the nun confronted one of them and asked, "What is the language that you were speaking?" It was not Lingala. And they said, "No, it wasn't." And so, but we thought that Lingala was your language. And the person said, "No, we thought that Lingala is your language. And that's why we speak Lingala with you." Okay, so, whether the children speaking Lingala are going to stop speaking Kikongo when they raise their own children,
That's
my answer would be, if Mobutu has remained in power, chances are that they would speak Kikongo to their children, because Mobutu exploited the population so much that people in Bakongo and Bandundu started hating Lingala. So there would have been enough pressure for people just to resist Lingala. But now the rest is just a matter of speculation. But now the question that you raise about French not being endangered because it is needed to unify the country, this is how I interpret it. If you are in the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, that's not how you see it. And I was on one of the councils of the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie for 10 years. And one of the major concerns, worries of OEF in the abbreviated form, is that French is either stagnating or contracting in Africa. And they kicked me out of the council because I kept saying, you know, who cares? Because we have our languages, we shouldn't be worried too much about French anyway. But they had good reasons to worry about it, because one thing, they thought that something may happen to the Congo or elsewhere similar to what happened in Rwanda, where you have a politician that says, we don't need French, we're going to speak English. It's spoken by more people around the world and we want to shift to French. And that could happen. And then I would address this in the same way that I addressed Janzen's question. If you don't have the economic machinery engaged in it, you are wasting your time. And one thing that you're going to find in Kinshasa, the guys at the craft market, they'll surprise you. They speak English very well. And they identify you as an American, they are going to speak to you in English, not in French. But they also know, but by doing it this way, you're going to pay them more money. Okay, that's the other side of it. But Lingala, French is considered endangered because if in over 60 years of using French in the education system, barely 20% of the population, according to several estimates, speak French comfortably. Then financially, economically, there's been a waste of money, there's been a waste of time, because no particular population structure has been developed to valorize French more so that people can feel more motivated to speak French. What has happened is that French has been learned the same way that we learn algebra, that we learn trigonometry or whatever, and after we get our certificate d'etat, we drop it.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so this is one of the things that are happening. But the other thing is that in the Francophone culture, if you don't speak French well, don't speak it.
Yeah.
Because people are going to make fun of you.
Yeah.
And it's something that I told the French at the OEF. The French should be more tolerant of les Français d'Afrique instead of deriding les Français d'Afrique. That is another factor against French. The other thing, coming from Bandundu, when I arrived in Kinshasa for the first time, and I didn't speak Lingala, I was automatically branded as an intellectual Muvila. Muvila is a villager, well-educated. You are an educated Muvila because you are not urban, you are not modern. There is a sense of modernity in Kinshasa that is different from the interpretation of modernity elsewhere. You are more modern if you are also fluent in Lingala. And now what you notice in Kinshasa, for those that go there frequently, politicians from Kasai, from Eastern Congo and so forth, who have moved to Kinshasa, they really make an effort to speak Lingala too, because they don't want to fall in the category of educated Muvila. So that is something else that is happening there. Another dimension of it, we can empower our major indigenous languages to function as official languages. You can have several official languages like in Switzerland. You know, it can work. But in order for this to work and to avoid the kind of conflicts that you fear, economic development. If your economy is well developed and so forth, then you won't have to worry about who is getting the greater part of the pie. And you are not going to fight each other. You will be quite comfortable with that. And that is, you know, part of the problem. And so, and you put all these things together, you can say, well, there are a lot of things that are working against Lingala, but there are also a lot of things that are keeping Lingala, especially when the political leadership is serving the West more than it is serving the country. You know, when you try to, you see what is going on there. So we are in a position where nothing is really resolved. French is not benefiting much, but while French is not benefiting much, Lingala is becoming stronger, Kiswahili is becoming stronger, Kikongo is becoming stronger, and the result of it is that if the language of education remains French, then we have a poor education system.
Okay, friends, I know that there are many questions, but time is distance here. We've got to conclude. Sally, the concerns about Kikongo are just being expressed everywhere. In fact, I was born not far from Kimpese in Lukala. And here, just in the platform, we've got people who are in Kimpese. Last time we spoke with them, they said how just being just in Kimpese, just with the children, they speak. Rather than speaking Kikongo, they speak Lingala. And as you know, Sally, that this is one of the concerns of people like what's his name again? Nemwandansemi, the fellow from Bundu dia Congo, who just and relating the issue to cultural identity. But again, Fredolin Mbongo, who is the Congolese cardinal, just bishop of the Catholic Church, just has expressed his concern that he's a Mungala, but he's so sad to see that Kikongo is disappearing. That just was his statement, just as he did his tour from Kinshasa to Boma, and he got to Boma and said that I'm so saddened that you people here in the Lower Congo don't use Kikongo anymore. And Sally, I went to Angola more than 4 times just to do some work with the Togo Church. And as I was traveling around the country, mainly the north, among the Bazombo, just I was so surprised to see that children as young as 5, they weren't born in Kinshasa or in Brazzaville, but the children in the villages, they speak Lingala. And we are talking about Angola here. And just need to say that the concerns are really real. And just is it because of Congolese music, just which is sung just with dance rumba by just singing Lingala and so on and so forth. But really the concern is there that people are seeing Kikongo just disappearing. And in fact, I want to finish that as far back as 1992, I was in England studying, where a former Baptist missionary told me that how sad he was that Congo people don't speak Kikongo anymore. Is it because just the Lower Congo province is near Kinshasa or what? I don't know. Just I think you are desperate really to advise us more on those issues, but the concern is there.
The concern is there, and there are different scenarios. One of the things in the way that I approach language evolution, and this is part of language evolution, I usually tell people all evolution is local, subject to local ecological conditions. Okay, the case of Azombo, if the people are returnees from the Congo, remember that they had already shifted to Lingala as their primary language while they were refugees there, and they went back home speaking Lingala. And if they live mostly among themselves, it's normal that they would transmit Lingala to their children. And if these observations are based on what goes on in cities, in urban centers, I wouldn't get worried too much, because the villages operate differently. But if in the villages, people are still using Lingala, then we have a reason to be concerned. So that's how you have to look at it. So in places like Boma, Matadi, and so forth, okay, there is something that you have to pay attention to. And this has been going on for a long time, especially since Mobutu. Mobutu had an administrative system where you didn't have the locals to govern the respective ethnic groups or populations. And so administrators came from outside, and they came along with the military, and these people spoke Lingala. And it could be that in the public sphere, people speak Lingala just to accommodate the people in power. But in their private lives, that's another story, whether they speak Lingala or don't speak Lingala. And the people, the locals that are there, don't just listen to me, test my approach, and come and tell me and everybody else what the local dynamics are and whether there is really reason to be concerned about this. Because languages can coexist, and people can show preferences for one language or another without the language necessarily, a particular language necessarily being endangered. When I grew up, I spoke Kiansi and Kikongo Kituba. The brother right behind me spoke only Kikongo Kituba, not Kiansi. But our sister spoke Kiansi and Kikongo like me, and things like that. And so we had a very young brother who spoke only Kikongo Kituba, but when he came to France, he started speaking Kiansi. Oh. In other words, he gave us the impression that he didn't know Kiansi, but he had passive knowledge of it. And when he saw that Kiansi could be useful to him, especially in terms of getting help from other immigrants and so forth, from the same background, he spoke Kiansi. So these things are hard to tell. On the other hand, the pressure that you feel abroad is not the same kind of pressure that you feel at home. When I was in the Congo, I was reluctant to speak Lingala in Kinshasa, and I was quite happy to be an educated Mufwene. I came to the United States. Most of the Congolese that I had to socialize with spoke Lingala. And I learned to speak Lingala. I didn't have to take classes. I activated my passive knowledge of Lingala.
What I would just want to say is that language, the way you keep language from extension is to keep talking and speaking the language, but at the same time, you have to write it. And in our case, in Bandundu, Americans and French, Belgian people have tried to talk about the culture than ourselves. So my question to the professor, what are we doing to keep our language alive from extension? Because we don't write. It's something that I didn't hear you addressing. And that's my first question. My second question is, with these rural exodus that we see, everybody now is going to live in urban area, and everybody is selling to everybody. Is that something that the next president or somebody who is going to be in power can exploit to make sure that, Africa explode in terms of becoming a powerful continent, a powerful, countries like the Congo, because everybody now is learning to sell, and everybody buy and everybody sells. So that's, for me, is extraordinary. When I went in 2019, you see everybody selling and everybody buying. This is a phenomenon that we have to study, and what's going to happen, how can we exploit that to make sure that, Africa becomes stronger and stronger and stronger, even though now the European, American are exploring the continent, but in the future, the continent can become just as stronger, even stronger than other countries. That's my observations, if you can address them.
Yeah, those are very interesting questions and complex ones too. I want to say, there is rural exodus, but there is also exodus from the city that people don't talk much about. People that are disenchanted with life in the city, people that come to close to retirement or just after retirement, and they realize that they cannot sustain living in the city anymore, and they go back to the village because whatever they have saved will help them live less expensively than in the city. But when they go, they also feel pressure to reassure the people that they had left behind that they have not changed culturally and they speak the language. So that is the other thing that is going on there. And when the people in the village see this guy who had lived in the city who still speaks the heritage language, they realize that they don't have to give up their heritage language. Regarding writing, well, African societies have for the longest been illiterate and relied on oral tradition. And what really keeps a language alive is opportunities to use the language. And the opportunities, Pierre Bourdieu spoke of language markets. Language markets, that's not place where you sell languages and so forth, but where you create dynamics for language to be languages to be sustained and to be they may be in competition with each other, but they may also face the competition quite well, and so forth. Writing is excellent for preserving information. Okay, and so that is useful. Is also modern societies are becoming more and more literate. There is every reason for Africa to also become more and more literate, but a whole lot of that depends on economic development, and economic development must take precedence to just forcing people to speak a particular language. And economic development can create incentives for people to practice the language. Quebec has shown this very well with French by empowering French economically. Then the Francophones became more and more interested in maintaining the language instead of shifting to English and so forth. And it has worked very well. But other than that, we have alternative technology. We can record things even digitally now. And if we know how to preserve these recordings, very well, then there is also a way of keeping a record of the language. Because writing or recording does not come as an alternative to speaking. The primary means of keeping a language alive is for people to speak the language, or if they are signers, to sign the language, and that is how it is going to be kept alive. And we have to make a distinction between maintaining a language and preserving a language. Preserving a language, that is like you preserve a dead brain in a jar, or you preserve fruits in a jar, and you have the impression that the fruit is alive and it isn't. But maintaining a language is when you can really engage people in communication, face-to-face interaction in that language.
Thank you very much, friends. I think we just done there. We didn't hear from our friend, Professor Cohen, Boston, in Belgium. Just Cohen, est-ce que vous avez une question? Do you have any question because we are done? Cohen, do you have any question, my friend?
Yeah, if there is time,
Oh, yes, go ahead, Cohen. I wish just
I would like to ask a question that had always fascinated me. I know that Professor Mufwene was talking about Kikongo and Kituba. I think it might be a good occasion to ask it. First of all, of course, I want to thank him for his brilliant presentation. The question I had is in the name for Kikongo Yaleta, it's one of its names, or its names. It's also known as Kituba or Monokutuba.
Monokutuba.
Meaning, yeah, I speak, but. So Professor Mufwene is situating the origins of this Kikongo Yaleta in Kimanyanga, but I've always wondered the term tuba, the verb stem tuba, for to speak, for as far as I can judge, and that's also what Laman is indicating in his dictionary. It's a typical West Kikongo term, so more used in the languages spoken along the coasts around Cabinda and the Congo mouth. In Dibu, in other varieties, you have Kuvova, Kuhora in Kintandu. So does Professor Mufwene, do you have any explanation for that, Sally, how this tuba term got used, if the origin is in Kimanyanga?
Well, the name of the language, I think when people develop a new language, they don't think about how they are going to name it. You know, a language just evolves, and then at some point somebody stipulates that there is a separate variety that has emerged, and that is retrospectively. And in the process, I think as I was growing up, people spoke of Monokutuba or Monokutuba. That's the foreign way of saying it, because missionaries often say Monokutuba, but the local said Monoketuba. And the fact that tuba, kutuba, or kituba, and so forth, tuba has been used invariably in the varieties outside the Bakongo area. That is why they designated it like that. And it was derisively because, like, if you speak any of the Kikongo languages, then you wouldn't be speaking like that. And we in Bandundu refer to it as Kikongo Yaleta. And some people refer to it as Kikongo Yabulamatari. I wrote a paper on this. I can send you a copy of the paper. But otherwise, that's all I know. And the person that started this hypothesis about Kikongo Kituba having evolved from Kimanyanga is Harold Federo in 1956. So the paper, a small book that he published. And that has been spread around by William Samarin. And William Samarin actually even published a book, The Black Man's Burden. 1989, I think. And what he shows is that because of the porterage system and people carrying commodities from Manyanga to the coast, it is possible that the language actually originated in Manyanga, which was a pre-colonial trade center. And then from there, things moved around, but also the construction of the railroad and the fact that a lot of workers were brought from outside the Congo area, but Congo didn't want to work in the construction of the railroad. And so the workers were brought from as far away as Tanzania to work there. And they are the ones that really developed this new variety of Kikongo, which later on the colonial administrators took into the interior, and that means Bandudu and so forth. And of course, we modified it even further, and then it spread all around. But then Federer was also very perceptive. He identified several varieties of Kikongo Kituba. It's not really that homogeneous. The variety spoken in the Kikwit area is different from the variety spoken in the Bandunduville area, and it is different from the variety spoken in Congo Brazzaville. And I came across Bakongo speaking Kikongo Kituba. You know, I noticed some differences between the way they speak it and the way we speak it in Bandundu, but we are mutually intelligible. So that's all I know, but I can otherwise I cannot answer your question, and that is actually.
But I see. So it would be the Kikongo Yaleta would have been used by people who are saying monoketuba or kituba, using that verb to say to speak. So people from outside the Bakongo, yeah, that sounds
right.
Good explanation. Yeah.
Can I make a short comment here?
Yes.
Tuba actually is to toss, to throw away. It's like speaking in a way that's not really that polite. That's Kutuba.
Okay.
Yeah. And then Kibula Matari would come from the stone crackers.
Yes.
Because Bula is to crack. And that's why Kikongo Yaleta also has for synonym Kibula Matari, Kibula Matadi, if you wish.
It's a stonebreaker.
Yeah, stonebreaker. So when we speak about Kikongo in general, there is some kind of confusion between what Kikongo, the vernacular spoken in villages, the one you're calling variations like Kimanyanga, Kindibu, etc. But Kibula Matari, that is Monokutuba or Monoketuba, that's the lower Congo, Kikongo variety of, lingua franca, so to speak. And then in Bandundu, it's Kituba. I usually have trouble when they send to me a text to translate, and they would say, we want to be translated into Kikongo. I would always ask, what Kikongo? Is it Kituba, Kikongo Yaleta, that is, or Kikongo vernacular? I think it might serve a purpose to always specify what variety we want it to be in.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I actually didn't know the name Kituba until I came to the United States and started learning the literature on Kikongo, reading literature on Kikongo Kituba. Because for us in Bandu, there was a Kikongo or Kikongo Yaleta. And Kikongo Yaleta, it was not so much in contrast with any Kikongo that can be spoken anywhere. Kikongo Yaleta was by association with the colonial system. And the people that spoke Kikongo Yaleta are people that operated within that administrative regime. And for many of us, I think it was a shock to find somebody from outside Bandudu that said, I speak Kikongo, and then they speak Kintandu or Kimanyanga or whatever, and we don't understand it. So Okay. Yeah.
There you go.
I think, friends, we've got to just 2 more questions, but we've got to be done. Your time is just 12:36. Thank you very much, Professor Sally. And I think we need to bring you back to speak about Kikongo because the topic is so interesting, let alone speak about the history of Kituba. And I was so happy to see many missionaries here. And I see my friend, Dr. Mvula, who is from Kikongo Vanga, and again, who worked with many missionaries there. And also, I know that, however, variations there are in Kikongo, just somebody from Manyanga, from Bisingombe, even from Bazombo, when they speak, just intelligibility is there.
Yeah.
And that's not really the issue. Maybe the question about accent, yes. And again, there are some words which are, for instance, I speak in Libu. Yesterday I was speaking to my friends in Lukala, and they say, but now, Adrien, just your accent is really Kimanyanga now. But I was born just in Lukala where we speak in Libu. And even Kimpese Kowen, Kimpese, which is in the Bandibu land, but when you get to Kimpese today, just most of people there speak Kikongo with Kimanyanga accent. Why? Because there are just many people coming from the other side of the river there. And if you go to Kulungongo, for instance, from Kulungongo to Kimpangu there, the accent which is so prevalent now is Kizombo. Why? Because there were many refugees and so on, refugees who came from Kibokolo, Damba, from Angola, from the north part of Angola, who speak Kikongo, but with the Kizombo accent, which means that the local people there in Kulungongo, Luvaka, Nkende, just they speak Kikongo today with some strong Kizombo accent, but they are Ndibu. And that's very, very interesting. But in terms of understanding one another, there is no big issue. And just when Kituba of Matadi is spoken, or even that of Boma is spoken, just somebody like me who has never been to Matadi, I understand. And again, just that's quite interesting. Time is the problem here. We've got to finish. And I know that Professor Ndonga from Angola is there, who has also been influenced by Professor Sally. But désolé, Professeur Ndonga, tu es là, juste pour dire bonjour ben voilà, à tes amis qui sont là, Cohen, et puis le professeur Sally qui t'a beaucoup influencé. But I think we need to finish by...
Bonjour ou bonsoir.
Ce sont des gens que tu as influencés, Sally, donc le professeur Ndonga qui est en Angola.
Et moi aussi.
Et ben toi aussi, ben voilà. The people that have influenced. I think we need to talk about this topic again. Just it's very, very interesting. Just not only because of concerns, but the richness of the topic. Just let us end, but there, just stop the recording.